Welcome everyone to Emergency Management for First Nations, Documentation and Administration for the Emergency Management Assistance Program, specifically for evacuations, response, and recovery. I'm Brad Eisen, the resident hazardscape Mooniow, and the reason I'm providing this training is because I've been working for 16 years now in policy, grants, the Emergency Management Assistance Program, disaster recovery programs for First Nations, other Indigenous communities, and non-Indigenous communities. So I've been working with the policy around this for a very long time, the documentation that's needed, the administration of the funding and the long-term recovery that communities go through. So I'm going to spend my time on this part here. So why do we need to prepare? Our communities already have a financial system. They already have a team. They already have a filing system, or they maybe use a financial system that's in the cloud, or they use something like Sage or Zintax or whatever it is. Why do we need to prepare if that structure and organization already exists in a nation? There's a few reasons. One, in my 18 years, I have not come across an organization, a community, or a team that is ready to manage the influx of money and documentation and requirements from the government that exist during a big disaster, even a small emergency. I've also been part of dozens of federal government audits around disaster recovery and emergency management assistance program funding. I know what the government is going to look at 5, 3, 2 years after a claim is submitted and complete. So what the point of this training is really to prepare nations for the influx of money and work, because not even the government of Alberta, not even government of BC, not even the federal government, not even tribal councils or large First Nations that are doing really, really well are ready to deal with the chaos and the influx of money and work that comes following a large disaster. So we're going to talk about specifically Indigenous Services Canada, or ISC, the Emergency Emergency Management, EMAP Assistance Program, or EMAP. That is the main grant program for First Nations, Indian Act bands, for evacuations, preparedness, response, recovery, mitigation. But we're going to stick to 3 areas. We're going to talk about evacuations. We're going to talk about response. And we're going to talk about recovery. If you've taken an incident command system or similar type of training, or even our basic emergency management training, and if you've watched some of the videos that Stacy's put out about First Nations emergency management coordinators and that role, you'll notice Stacy talks a lot about finance, budgets, documentation. If you've taken incident command system, you'll know there's a finance and administration role. And if you've been part of an emergency within an incident management team system, or with an emergency operations or emergency coordination center, typically finance and administration are the last things to get taken care of within the first couple of days of a big disaster, because during an evacuation, what is the number one priority? Save lives. Get people out, get people safe, get animals out, get animals safe. there's not really a big discussion during an evacuation about who's tracking the money, who's doing the documentation. Really, the goal is spare no expense, don't lose one life, get members out, get them safe. So, and that's okay because saving lives, protecting the environment, uh, keeping first responders and security and people helping others, keeping them safe are the priorities. We want to make sure, though, that as you go through an evacuation, at some point in time, documentation, financial tracking, all of that is set up, organized, and done in a way that's going to allow you to maximize your funding from the government. You can prepare now for that because really it's just about scaling up your existing system, maybe adding in a few new things, and having a plan to be prepared. So in an evacuation, everything's very chaotic, and the scenario I'll use is if you're going to evacuate an entire community. So what happens when all the finance staff get evacuated? What happens if they don't have laptops? What happens if they can't access all of the things that they need to perform their job? Well, part of the planning piece and the preparedness piece falls under business continuity or continuity of operations, which means creating a system where employees can access the tools that they need when they're not in community. So whether that's having a financial system on the cloud, staff having laptops that they can take home, especially during high hazard seasons for wildfire and evacuations like spring and summer, having team muster points or evacuation areas pinpointed and determined ahead of time. So say, for example, a finance team might want to evacuate to a nearby municipality. They'll meet at a large hotel where they can rent a conference room and set up a small finance department, or at least join in with the emergency operations center or emergency coordination center, wherever they might be, and maybe work from there. Or if they have to disperse, might even be having to work from hotels and working remotely. But whatever the case is, and we go into more of that planning more in depth, but during an evacuation, it's very chaotic and things are disrupted. So the goal is having your tools and system set up to work remotely or come together somewhere else. Having things saved on a cloud drive like policy, forms, templates, timesheets, whatever tools you use day to day to track overtime, time, costs, POs, purchase order books, whatever it is, have templates of those saved somewhere, or have them printed out in a binder that can be taken with someone during an evacuation. Maybe the chief finance officer or whoever is in charge of finance, the finance manager, maybe they carry that binder in their vehicle in case they need to evacuate and they've got it all ready to photocopy. So during an evacuation, it's all very chaotic. There's a lot of people helping out. There's a lot of people going to be expecting to be paid. There's probably a lot of staff putting in overtime. There's probably a need for purchasing radios if the nation doesn't already have them, paying for fuel, paying for hotels, paying for food. Maybe it's hiring more security and having to outfit them with security vests or beacons for their vehicles, signage. All these expenses are going to start to crop up in the first 6 hours, 12 hours, 24 hours, and they're going to keep piling up. And you're you're likely going to have, during a big evacuation, people, if they're not trained or familiar with your nation's finance policy or your financial system, they're not going to know how to get a PO. They may not know how to make a purchase. They're not going to know who a nation has PO set up with in a nearby community. They may not even have a credit card or the money to purchase it themselves. So it's having discussions with your emergency management team about that system, who the leads are, who's going to be authorized for those POs, who they're going to talk to get those POs, who's in charge of making decisions on expenditures, because it's going to be chaotic. And I'll tell you now, managers, directors in housing, public works, capital projects, even community services, education, and health, they're just going to be doing what they need to do to make them and themselves and their staff safe, and their clients or their patients. So there's going to be chaos, and the organization is important, because all of those costs during an evacuation should be eligible through ISK's Emergency Management Assistance Program. So one thing that the nation needs to do is set up a new department ID for the disaster or emergency. Because all of the costs, whether it's from health, education, public works, chief and council, wherever, all of the costs for the evacuations need to be coded to that ID. So later on, finance can go back and track all of those costs separately. So they can send them to ISK, Indigenous Services Canada, for reimbursement. ISK is going to require every single piece of paper, every receipt, just like any other grant program. They're going to require it to be submitted separately from other grant submissions. So making sure that anyone who has expenditure officer authority at the nation, they know that this new DEPT ID, whatever number it is, that has to get pushed out to the emergency management team, to the emergency operations or coordination center, to start using. So when they make purchases, they put the DEPT ID or code on every single receipt, invoice, piece of paper. During an evacuation, I would say the majority of things are eligible, as long as they're not large capital purchases. Like, you can't go out and buy a brand new truck or a bus. You can rent a truck and rent a bus, but you can't purchase any large capital things. You can purchase toiletries, and you can purchase clothing, and you can purchase things that people will need, and you can purchase safety vests, and you can lease radios. Can't buy radios, you could lease them. So the other part to all of this is being able to give your staff and your members and those on the emergency management team some guidelines to know what can be purchased and what's eligible under EMAP. Hiring. So during an evacuation response and recovery, it's not a typical funding agreement or grant program where ISK will give the nation a 15% admin cost amount. That doesn't happen. What happens is the nation, if they need staff, security, extra finance people, extra help, they can hire whomever, whatever they need in terms of staff or contractors or other resources, but they have to be temporary and contracted. You cannot develop, for any of this, 5 brand new full-time permanent jobs. You can create 5 full-time temporary contracted positions, or you can hire contractors, but you cannot develop brand new full-time permanent roles. Okay? And they can be salaried, they can be hourly or part-time, whatever your nation's HR policy has in terms of what is a volunteer versus a full-time employee versus a contractor, subcontractor. You still got to follow your nation rules. But ISK through EMAP during an evacuation and response will pay for the nation to hire temporary contracted services. Coordinators. I like to guide nations in having a standard response or recovery coordinator job description that speaks to some very high-level roles and responsibilities around helping to coordinate documentation, helping to scan receipts and invoices, helping to file, helping to sort of be a general support in whatever is needed, someone who's flexible and can do many things, right? It's that coordinator position. That's kind of what you need to be ready for, because you're going to need people power. During the response, so going with the scenario of a very big disaster where, let's say, a community in a remote area, wildfire comes into the community, whole community evacuates, 20, 30 homes are burned down or more, everything's shut down. That response is going to last, it could last weeks to months in terms of how long are people evacuated, how long does it take to fight the fire, put out hotspots, could be weeks to months, and get the community safe to return. This is kind of where we edge into a very specific part of recovery called re-entry planning. But again, you've got an evacuation going on, you've got a response going on, costs are piling up, invoices are coming in, overtime is piling up, hotels are being built, group lodging, whatever it is. Maybe your nation decides to house members in tent frames or build quick cabins. Whatever your options or your decisions are, those costs are going to start piling up. People are going to want to start knowing that they're going to get paid. That's why you've got to start the hiring. So during this time, the documents, the costs are moved to Indigenous Services Canada as soon as possible. You can ask ISK for an advance through their Emergency Management Systems program to deal with all of the money that's going out. You can ask them for an advance. I always recommend nations, if it's a full community evacuation and it looks like it's going to be weeks to months, I would just start with 10 million. They can advance. As soon as you start an EMAP claim, they're authorized to pay out $50 million in that first fiscal year without going to the minister. So get that advance, but also start to get the documents and costs to them as soon as possible so they can start reviewing them. Because that's going to reduce the risk on their end that the money is being spent inappropriately, that it's being spent in line with EMAP, and you want to show that the money is being used for eligible things as soon as possible so ISK can start to continue to make payments. So this submission process, I would say for a very large event, it should be weekly. You want to get into a rhythm where the past week's invoices and costs are being entered into the finance system. They're being entered into the nation's general ledger. They're being scanned or filed. And the general ledger with all the receipts and invoices, POs, go to ISK on a weekly basis. ISK has a portal for file transfers. I would recommend that if nations don't have this system set up on their end already, you immediately do that now and get it ready and get trained on it. So when you have to send all these invoices and scan documents in general ledger to ISK, including, I'll say that in a second. I'll make a note here for payroll. You have access, so you're not transferring all of this through email, because your email, their email, it can only allow you so much space to send documents. Having to send 7 or 8 emails with 600 megabytes of PDF documents and scans is really annoying, and it's hard to track, and it's very unorganized. So you want to early on get ISK's portal set up so you can do large file transfers in one. The other piece to that is that it works well is it keeps it organized. So it's like a filing system. ISK can go in and access it. It shows when they access it. It shows what they look at. It de-risks for the nation anything getting lost. Okay. Weekly, bi-weekly, I would say, or whenever your pay schedules are, you also have to send ISK your payroll. So all of the staff that are involved in the evacuation and response, whether they're pre-existing full-time staff making overtime or new hires or hourly, you've got to send ISK a list of everybody's names and the amount of overtime or the pay for that period, because they will also reimburse you for that payroll, for your payments. And you want these payments coming in weekly, especially if we're talking about an evacuation or response and the start of a recovery that's going into the 40, 50, 100, 200 million dollar range or higher. You don't want this to slow down. Super important. Because ISK is going to have the same problem that the community is having. They don't have the staff and the people sitting there waiting for the influx of all these things. And they're very slow to hire. So at least the nation being prepared is a good idea. Then you can, on your end, do what you need to do. So during a reentry, again, it's about community safety. You've got maybe now the hotspots and firefighting's done. Public Works is maybe making sure the water treatment's back up and running. If it's a really bad smoke, if there's a lot of smoke in the community and people were out for a month and they do inspections of the health center, the band offices, the stores, whatever, they've got to be tested for contaminants, because you don't want to go back to a community that isn't fully restored. So at the very minimum, a community should have the water up and running. It would be good if the health center was up and running, but it's not necessary. You can contract ambulance providers, paramedics, to go in the community to work and be there for key public works staff and nation staff that have to be there to get the community ready, at least to bring people back in. Again, it's overtime, it's costs, it's contractors, a lot of expenses. Then when you get into the recovery, especially if it's a sort of a medium to long term, and when I say medium or long term, I mean most of the community has moved back in. Maybe you have some members that can't go home because their house was either damaged or burned down. This medium could be 6 months. The long term can go up to 5 to 6 years. This process will continue that whole time. You're going to need extra finance staff and coordinators to help with that, because the staff you had before the event are going to come back to work and focus on continuing your normal business operations, your normal community operations. So very important to get those people in place early, prepare job descriptions pre-written, hiring, everything like that ready to go if it's looking to get into this long term. Audits will be at some point. Indigenous Services Canada, they don't really have documented guidance on what their EMAP audits look like. They're not really sure, at least as of October 4th, 2025, what does an audit look like at the end of this? Because as Stacy mentioned, and I mentioned in some earlier videos, is all this money that's coming in for all these costs, they are approved in principle. And that's a key thing to know. ISC will tell you that these costs are approved in principle to EMAP. They should be eligible, but they will not approve and finalize those decisions until this audit. So the risk, again, falls on the nations, because they could spend $80 million, have it all approved in principle, but when these auditors show up, they're going to be asking a lot of questions. Now, if you've got all your documentation, you've got all the emails from ISC that show everything's approved in principle, you should be fairly safe. However, ISC will always tell you it's never a guarantee until this is done. You will never get 100% approval in these early days for costs. It's completely ridiculous. I could spend a lot of time venting about that, but that's just the way it is today. So in terms of EMAP, evacuation planning is not just about how are you going to get people out and where are they going to go, how are they going to stay safe. It's about the administration and documentation preparedness, well, about setting up that system, organized staff, hiring to make sure that everything is tracked, dealt with, sent to ISC, reimbursed, ready for audit when that time comes. Like I said at the beginning, you could have a great system in your community. Everything, it could be running very smoothly like a well-oiled machine. However, once this happens, you don't know if staff will have access to the tools they need. You don't know if staff will be able to work, dependent on their situation. After an evacuation, it's not uncommon for people to not return to the community for a long time. So you may see some attrition or people leave. I know during evacuations with First Nations, members are at much higher risk to falling back to leaning on their addictions or substance abuse or having other mental health issues during the evacuation, because they're so disrupted, they can't deal with the stress, so they fall back to some past behaviors. That can disrupt their ability to work or even come back to work. So you've got to be ready to deal with all of this through these periods. And there's no organization that is going to be perfect at this during the most chaotic time of a community's time, whatever you want to call it. So these are some early considerations on preparedness planning for evacuations response and especially long-term recovery. There, we're going to be doing some more videos specifically on the long-term recovery, getting more in depth into tools and templates and things nations need to consider for a long-term recovery, especially with ISK, because they're not going to be prepared. They don't have the staff and resources to manage things. You have to manage them. Okay? So we'll get into that later. Thanks for listening. We'll see you in the next video.